Hello, I wanted to comment on some recent news that I heard about. My name is Abdul. I'm a former federal prosecutor that handled healthcare fraud cases, and I just heard about the 23andme bankruptcy, and this has me surprised because I had thought about signing up for 23andme and I didn't because of these privacy concerns. But if you haven't heard, 23andme has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection and it's actively seeking a buyer. The company was very successful, once worth about $6 billion after going public in 2021. And all along, people knew that it was going to have some privacy concerns because people are basically giving their DNA to this company to analyze. And a lot of people were using it to find out about their family lineage and background. Some people were using it to find out about potential health issues that may come up down the road. The company has had challenges. It had a major data breach in 2023, so that wasn't too far ago, and 7 million customers had their personal information um, basically out there on the internet. And now that the company is being sold in bankruptcy proceedings, um, they talk about safeguarding customer data throughout the process, with which no doubt they will have the data likely secured um, and transferred over to the new entity. But this is really unusual because not a lot of companies have people's personal private information, especially their genetic information, on hand. So the difference between 23andMe and let's say a hospital or a lab testing company is that they're regulated by two different sets of rules. Everyone has heard of HIPAA. Genetic data for healthcare providers is regulated by HIPAA, but this is not a healthcare provider. And so why should you care? Well, let's do a recap on DNA. DNA is uniquely sensitive, so your genetic data is the most personal information that exists about you. And I used to prosecute cases at the DA's office, and we did use DNA for a lot of our crimes to identify people because it was that unique. Um, so this information is not just about you, it's also about your family history, and having that information out there is not something that can be contained. Also, the while there are regulations out there like Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that provides you some protections with regards to health insurance, your genetic data in the long term can be used against you potentially for life insurance evaluation, disability insurance, or long-term care, and none of those are protected by GINA's protections. Also, you potentially face some employment discrimination. The law doesn't apply to employers with fewer than 15 employees. The GINA statute. So you're potentially looking at, and many of the employers in this country are small businesses. It also doesn't protect you in military employment or other situations. Finally, a new owner of 23andMe might be more willing to give information to law enforcement. So they may share this data with law enforcement, making your information accessible for criminal investigations without your knowledge and consent. Now, law enforcement has a number of ways of getting that information through court orders, through subpoenas and things like that, but that usually requires some kind of active investigation into you. They have to know that you have used 23andMe, and then they have to send a subpoena or some kind of court order, some kind of legal process to obtain that information with 23andMe and then match it up against your information. The problem with having it out there is that now law enforcement can just purchase this and put it into a database, and they don't need to go through that process, and their own internal processes are protected. So you're never going to know exactly how law enforcement came to learn about this information unless you litigate that in court. So it's just going to be one more piece of information that a governmental entity is going to have access to without legal process. Um, And if you opted into any of the research programs that 23andMe had, they're going to continue to use it. And it can be repackaged and used for other commercial purposes without you ever knowing about it. So it is so concerning that multiple state attorney generals, including the one in California, have issued alerts. And they basically are saying, delete your genetic data from these systems. And, as a customer, you have it in their systems because you use it in some way. But if you're not using it, delete it. They've recommended that you destroy samples of your genetic material, and they recommend that you revoke permission for your genetic data to be used for research purposes. I know people, and also the New York Attorney General has done that as well. It remains to be seen if the Texas Attorney General will do it. But if they are making these recommendations, then I tend to understand the reasoning behind it, and I recommend people who are asking me for advice to go ahead and delete that information. So let's talk about the practical steps that you can take. You can delete your data by logging into the 23andMe account. You go to your settings, you go to the data section, you click view, delete data, and permanently delete data. So it's fairly straightforward. But that's just going to delete the digital data. You also have a sample that they may have retained. You also want to go ahead and look for options to destroy the stored biological samples if they still retain it, or send an email to their support team and ask that to be destroyed. I know many places tend not to store data, store the physical samples unless it's absolutely required. So I personally would be surprised if they still had it, but you never know. The only people that I knew that held on to the actual samples were law enforcement agencies that needed it for court, but it's possible that a private entity would hold on to that sample for whatever reason. Many of the users automatically opted in for research to allow their genetic data to be used for research. I would recommend that they revoke that permission. And if you should decide you want to make your data available for research later on, make sure that it's not a company that's going through bankruptcy that basically no longer has the ability to enforce the agreement that you had with them. So, sometimes sometimes you make a deal with a company and tell them you give them permission for certain things. But once they go into bankruptcy, you no longer, or it's very difficult to enforce those rights, enforce that contract against the new entity that acquires it, because depending on how that contract is written, sometimes that transfers to the next entity, sometimes it doesn't, and good luck trying to deal with litigating that issue. Also, make sure that you take screenshots and have a good paper trail. For people who have done nothing wrong, and that's what a lot of people I talk to say, well, I've done nothing wrong. Who cares if they have my data? Again, it's not just about you, it's about your potential family members who are related to you. This genetic data is going to be used. The Texas Attorney General's office has sued car manufacturers who had been sharing driver usage data with car insurance companies without the user's knowledge or permission or explicit consent. And so there's pending lawsuits that are out there related to location data and driving habits. And there are people who are interested in this information, and health insurance companies are definitely interested in people's genetic information that they would otherwise not have access to. Because if you think about it, maybe for life insurance, you may have to take a medical exam, and they'll determine whether they're going to cover you and what your premiums are. But can you imagine if you were a health insurance company and you know that you potentially are going to insure somebody that has a high risk for cancer, but they don't have a medical history of that, meaning, they haven't seen a doctor or been diagnosed with cancer, but it runs in the family. Wouldn't you think that they would want to do that? Now, GINA, the act that prohibits health insurers from using genetic information to determine eligibility or set premiums, that exists. That protection exists because lawmakers saw that happens. But there are gaps. The law doesn't protect you when applying for life insurance. So again, even if the life insurance carrier may have a doctor do a checkup, they wouldn't know about your genetic history necessarily, but now they can purchase that because that information is out there. Long-term care insurance is another big one, disability insurance. These are expensive products, especially long-term care insurance and disability insurance. These are much more expensive for you should they know what your risk factors are. And they can basically use these markers to deny coverage or charge higher rates. So you're exposing yourself to a real problem with health insurance if you do this. These acts that exist out there about your genetic data, they're not supposed to be using it to hire you or fire you. But again, if you're thinking about joining the military or thinking about joining a small business, you are not protected by that. So a lot of the employment laws that exist for larger employers with more than 50 employees or more than 15 employees. But if you're going to a small company, and they are, it's not that they will go out and seek out this information on their own, right? So there's going to be brokers or third parties. Everybody is out there to make a buck, and there are going to be businesses out there that are going to try to sell a product to employers, whether it's a job screening site or something like that, just like they can pull up your credit score and your credit history, and that's part of the background check that small employers do. I would imagine that those background check type places would also potentially add in genetic information to let small employers know that, hey, if you bring this person on board and you, for example, you potentially are thinking about offering them health insurance, even though the insurance company, and this is kind of getting far afield, but even if the insurance company hypothetically cannot screen you for or use that as a basis to deny you coverage, many smaller many smaller businesses that do offer these kind of benefits sometimes do it under a self-insured policy, meaning they just take their employees and decide to insure them, and while your card might say Cigna or United Health, they actually act as a third-party administrator of your benefits, and they're providing the network and the coverage and the copay and the deductible and all that. They're doing the administration of it, but the person that's actually insuring you is the business, and they would not be covered by GINA. So this creates vulnerabilities to you in the job market. You potentially would be dealing with discriminatory practices there. And again, we've covered the law enforcement usage. This reminds me of apps. There's a lot of apps out there that people put on their phones that collect location history. And I remember there was a big controversy with, which one was it? I think it was like Muslim Pro or something, that this app would take users' location information, I think presumably to provide them prayer times of what time to pray, but apparently it was tracking their location, and this information was then sold to, I believe, a third party, and that third party then in turn sold it to the Department of Defense. And why would the Department of Defense want to know the location history of people who use Muslim Pro? Well, presumably they're Muslims, they want to generally know where they are. And so with this type of data, in that case, you would know the likely religious practice of that particular phone user that has that app, and then multiply by all the users on the app. That gives you a rough picture of where such people live, and then you take that data and then you cross-reference it with addresses and stuff, and you have a pretty good confirmation of maybe the level of religious practice this person has, because you're able to see how often they're attending mosque, or which mosques they're attending, or what community events they go to, or who they associate with. This is really powerful information based on location history, but you can always imagine genetic history being used. Hopefully it's used to solve crimes, but it potentially could be used for other reasons as well, in tracking people, not tracking people in terms of location history, but I imagine the genetic information could be used later on by law enforcement for who knows what purpose. I can't think of the creative ways this is used, but I also know that if law enforcement wants to get things, there's a process to get it, and it's not very difficult to get it, and it's audited and tracked, and there's checks and balances. I used to be a prosecutor for about 15 years, both at the state and federal level, and I frequently would get people's personal information, but that was under supervision of authorities. I'd have to go through a judge or a grand jury process to get that. But I also recall that there were a lot of tools that I could use that did not require that. For example, social media accounts that people have. A lot of the information they put on there is in public, but I'm not, as a law enforcement person, I'm not going to go into someone's Facebook account and look for what they have today, when maybe 4 years ago, that's what I'm interested in. That historical information is being scraped and kept by these third parties, and it's just out there because you put it out there. Now imagine if, and Facebook may say we're not going to give content to law enforcement unless they come with like a search warrant or something to that effect. But here, this genetic information is going to be available presumably without any such warrant because there is no protection mechanism for it. So, going forward, when you sign up for these types of things, because I'm honestly still interested in my genetic history and, who I might be related to, it's going to be very interesting, one, when you sign up for these companies, knowing that they potentially could go bankrupt. So always be aware of who you're sharing your information with, but also, look at their privacy policies carefully. I know a lot of people don't read them, and I know I throw away a lot of that stuff. My credit card company sends me a privacy notice, and I read it, and I'm thinking, what can I do about this? Because they send me a form, and then they tell me to write a letter, like stamped letter, to a particular address, opting out of something, and it's a real pain to do that. But in the case of my financial information, with so many data breaches, I honestly, I don't really care about that kind of stuff because I don't feel like I have that kind of exposure at this point in my life. But should my circumstances change, I definitely would. And I also think that, when it comes to your genetic information, I think you have to be a lot more careful. One of the things that people recommend is having a digital hygiene or privacy audit. I'd recommend people do that as well. And, if you are considering genetic testing for, health reasons, which I am, there are some HIPAA compliant genetic testing companies out there that you would work through your medical provider. And usually in that case, if you have a specific concern, like they will do genetic testing, for example, for parents who are expecting a child, and they want to know the genetic information related to that. That, I think, that's going to be protected by HIPAA. You're not going to run into this 23andme situation. But, there's a medical need for that. I think a lot of 23andme was born out of curiosity, just, it was a consumer-driven product using some health information to give them an answer. But, going forward, I think people are going to be a lot more careful about blending ease of access to this information. But you know what? It remains to be seen how far healthcare provider compliance rules, how far they go into the digital space, and how these companies characterize themselves. It's a very concerning development, and I'll be interested how this applies to other telemedicine providers, especially those that are sending out prescriptions to patients. Presumably that's protected, but which one of those services is and is not, that remains to be seen. Thanks for listening to my TED Talk here.